So here we are again, and today's lecture, it will begin in darkness, but as you'll see, there's more and more light as we see that medieval Europe, having been formed out of the anarchy of the Dark Ages, after 1000, there's an enormous surge forward in Western Europe, and in Western Europe really for the first time takes form from the 11th century onwards. So before we start the lecture proper, I want to do another review question with you. We're at question 28. Question 28, there's a quote: Paul was the true founder of Christianity as a world religion. Now, it's obvious that obviously Jesus is the central figure in Christianity, but as I have explained, his life unfolded in a thoroughly Jewish milieu. And in terms of explaining how Christianity became a world religion open to Jews and Gentiles, the central figure is Paul. So this is basically a overview. So what about Paul? Well, as I have noted before, he was actually born in what is in southern Turkey, in Smyrna, into a Jewish family, Pharisaic Judaism. But at the same time, being outside of Palestine, Paul was born in a milieu which was predominantly Greek, and of course it was all part of the Roman Empire. On the other hand, Jesus and his immediate followers, the most important of whom were Peter and James, they were still living in a thoroughly Jewish milieu, context. And in these early years of the church, the headquarters was Jerusalem, and we can speak about this early Christianity as a kind of Jewish Christianity. It was really a deviant form of Judaism. So much so that the early Christians continued to practice the Jewish religion for all practical purposes. The Jewish law still pertained, including, the laws governing things like food, circumcision, and so on. But at the same time, of course, the early Christians, they differed from other Jews in that they claimed that Jesus was indeed the Messiah, whereas and that he had brought, he was ushering the kingdom of God and universal redemption. And this certainly the Sadducees, the Pharisees um, rejected out of hand. Now, as I also explained, Saul, his original name was Saul. He came to Jerusalem to study with the rabbis, to study Pharisaic Judaism, and he obviously was quite familiar with it. And in fact, he was very incensed by the Christians. For him, the Christians were an offense to Judaism, and he became one of the most important of the persecutors of the early Christian church. And as I have explained, he was sent on a mission to Damascus in order to ferret out a secret Christian circle that had established itself in Damascus. But he was, in fact, he had a vision. He was converted to Christianity on the road to Damascus. And from that point onwards, he conceived his mission to be to spread the gospel of the coming of the Messiah, Jesus. And he decided to go back to his native Turkey and then onwards into Greece to spread the word. But the notable was the fact that he preached not only to the Jews, but also to the Gentiles. In other words, universal redemption indeed. And so you can't confine this message simply to the Jews. It also has to be spread to the Greeks and to all of the Gentiles who are prepared to listen. Taking this a step further, he basically said that the Jews belonged to what he considered to be the old covenant established way back at the time of Moses, with all of its laws and so on and so and regulations, whereas with the coming of Jesus as the Messiah, Christians were living under a new covenant with God based on the life and the sacrifice, the death of Jesus, which was integral to the salvation that God was now bringing to humankind. And so central, of course, to his conception was the new covenant was centered around the acceptance of Jesus as the Messiah, who, in accepting Jesus as the Messiah, one's sins were washed away as a result. All of this is in Paul's epistles, which can be found in the New Testament. Also, I noted that in the course of preaching this way, he represented, in order to explain himself to the Gentiles, to the Greeks, he presented Jesus in godlike fashion. He likely believed this, that Jesus was godlike in character. Now, this is a conception which is Greek, all right, but it is not Judaic. And so this represents a sharp break with Judaism. Well, there was a struggle in the church between those who wanted to keep the old covenant, wanted to remain Jews while accepting Jesus as the Messiah. And Peter was the main upholder of this view, and he was in a quarrel with Paul. But the quarrel, in effect, was decided by the fact that in 70 AD, the Jews in Palestine revolted against the Romans. There was a terrible destruction. The temple itself in Jerusalem was destroyed, and the Christian church had to move out of Palestine into the Greek world. And so Paul's conception essentially triumphed in this wider, more cosmopolitan milieu. Does anybody have questions about what I've presented?
I have a question regarding a final exam.
Yes, you're getting down to brass tacks, yes.
So when I checked Aurora, it said that the final exam is May 1st, but on syllabus it says that the final exam is April 19th. So which one should we trust?
Does it say May 1st? I'm very surprised.
Yeah,
In
it
any
does.
case, in any case, April the 19th is the date. At noon is when I'm putting up the final exam.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so to begin with, let's start out with the end of Charlemagne's reign. And we saw where Charlemagne had basically assembled Western Europe into a united empire, so it seemed. But after he died, his son proved weak, Louis the Pious, and when he finally died in 840, the empire fell apart. And as I remarked, it first of all divided into three parts, but more importantly, a feudal anarchy broke out. The centralized political authority disintegrated. You have a reversion, a regression back to the feudal anarchy that preceded the rise of the Carolingians and the barbarian invasions, the initial barbarian invasions. And indeed, what we find is that this feudal anarchy was reinforced by the fact that Europe was once again invaded by the Vikings, the Magyars, and the Arabs in the 9th and 10th centuries. This invasion can be counted as really the fourth invasion since the 3rd century AD. This new wave of invaders from the east, from the north, and from the south reinforced the feudal anarchy. And the result was that centralized government basically disintegrated, disappeared. And people in this circumstance, all you could depend upon was your local lord. Local or at best regional authorities were the only ones who could mount any kind of political control or any kind of defense against the foreign invaders, or the feudal anarchy, the internal wars between the aristocracy. It was only at the local level that people could find any kind of protection. And of course, this all reinforced the entrenchment of the feudal system. So this is the characteristic of the 10th and the 9th centuries. And it's in this period, really, you have a system of castles, you have or fortified palaces, and the armored knights. This whole system becomes deeply, deeply entrenched as a result. And of course, you have all of these figures who were already present. I'm talking about the dukes, the earls, the barons, the margraves, the aristocracy that we're vaguely familiar with, that we know from overall European history, this is the period when they really fully emerge. It's all been in gestation, but now over these 2 centuries, between about 800 and 1000, feudalism is really deeply established. Now, one of the most hard-hit areas was northern France. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to survey Western Europe. I'm going to give you an overview of the situation in Western Europe, say at the beginning of the 11th century, to give you, because different countries were in different conditions. Well, northern France was really in bad shape because, of course, you had the internal feudal wars going on, but also from Scandinavia, from Denmark and Sweden came the Vikings, and they wreaked havoc, not only along the coast, but northern France has very good rivers, particularly the Seine River that runs up past Paris. And the Vikings came right up the rivers, and they were raiding and pillaging and killing all over northern France. Indeed, they actually, toward the end of the 10th century, actually conquered this area. Normandy was conquered by the Normans in the 10th century, and so the Vikings became the overlords. And indeed, over the next century and a half, they basically became French, and they became part of the feudal system. And basically the head of the Vikings became the Duke of Normandy. The Duke of Normandy was basically a Viking. And you could see that even today, if you travel through Normandy, you see a lot of people with blonde hair. Most French people do not have blonde hair. But in Normandy, you do see a lot of blondes. And of course, that's related to the fact that these are Scandinavians. They come from Scandinavia. So that was the situation in northern France. Now, in southern France, the situation was somewhat better. The southern France was far enough from the Magyars and even from the Vikings to be spared the worst of it. And we could say, of course, it was feudal. It became feudal. The power of the landlords, of the seigneur, as we call them, was strong, but not as the whole feudal system was less entrenched in southern France than it was in northern France. And correspondingly, I would say that the peasantry were slightly better off in southern France than they were in the north. In any case, we can see what the situation was by the beginning of the 11th century. France is divided. You see that there are these different dukes and counts. For example, in eastern France, there's Burgundy, the Duchy of Burgundy, headed by the Duke of Burgundy. And he's, he has independent power. There's nobody who, he basically is the dominant power in this region. Likewise, in the southeast, in this region, you have the Count of Toulouse, named after the city, the little town, Toulouse in the south. Well, he's the major figure here. Then here in the southwest, you basically have the Duke of Aquitaine in this sort of I guess reddish brown area. Up here is the Duke of Brittany, the Duke of Normandy. But most important is France. Here up in the north is the Count of Flanders, but France is the most important. And France, that's the way people back then referred to it. We are, if they were in the south, they say, well, we are going to France. This region, which is today called the Ile-de-France, Paris is its center, was ruled in the 10th century by a duke, the Duke of France. His name was Capet, C-A-P-E-T, Hugh Capet, and he was a duke. But the title of king devolved on this guy. His headquarters was this dinky little town called Paris. And it was from there that over time, as we will see, that gradually all of these territories that were completely divided from one another were reintegrated by the King of France, who now eventually, and certainly by the end of the Middle Ages, basically became the ruler of the whole of France. This is how it happened. Now, I want to, having looked at France, I want to now look at a larger map of Europe as a whole. So I guess we can maybe use this as the map. Okay, so we saw France here. Let's look at England. What was going on in England at the beginning of the 11th century? Well, again, England was under attack from the Vikings. You'll recall that the Anglo-Saxons had invaded England at the end of the 5th century. Well, they were very divided. There were 6 or 7 different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in this relatively small country. But under the stress of the Viking invasions, they indeed did come together. And by the 11th century, a single Anglo-Saxon monarchy had emerged in England under the stress. Now, England was not, the Anglo-Saxons, of course, there was a landlord class and there was a dependent peasantry in England. But I would not say that England was a thoroughly feudal country until at this moment, say the beginning of the 11th century. And you can see this clearly in the way its military was constituted, because the peasantry, which was not true in any of the feudal countries, were actually part of the army. If there was a military emergency, and this was true, they were fighting the Vikings and so on, there would be the villagers would be called, the folk militia from the peasant militia would be called to fight alongside the nobles. And I explained last time, feudalism as it matured excluded the peasantry. Well, they were still included in this Anglo-Saxon kingdom. And the second thing is that the nobles, although they were the elite of the army, they were an infantry. They did not have horses. And so it was not really organized in a feudal way, although obviously there was a king and there were aristocrats. It was still not feudal. But this was their situation. But their problem was that across the channel here in Normandy, you had this extremely powerful dukedom, the Duke of Normandy, and his grandfather had been a full-blooded Viking. Uh, Looking at England, his name was William, and he goes down in history as William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy. He decided that England would be easy pickings for himself and the feudal forces, the armored knights on horseback that he controlled in the thousands. And so in 1066, the Duke of Normandy crossed the Channel and landed in England. He picked a quarrel with the king, Harold, and they met in battle. There was a full-scale showdown between the Anglo-Saxons and the invading Normans, and these feudal knights easily defeated the Anglo-Saxon military. Harold was killed, and William now made himself King of England as well. He was Duke of Normandy. He now became King of England, and in the wake of that, he totally reorganized. The Normans now became the rulers. All of the Anglo-Saxons, including the landlords, were subject to the Normans. They had conquered, and William imposed a full feudal system on the Norman knights. Were all given land in return for service. It was all very organized. It was a kind of organized feudalism that William imposed on England. Now, the situation in the Holy Roman Empire here on the map, called Germany, was still different. Was different. Here, of course, the head of state was the Holy Roman Emperor. He had inherited this title, Holy Roman Emperor, from Charlemagne. It went back to Charlemagne. So they were Holy Roman Emperors. And in this case, because you'll recall, this was the area where the barbarian invaders came from, the peasants here were not under the control of landlords as they were in England and France. The peasants were free. They held their land freely. And as a result of that, there was no feudal system. And because of that, the emperors at first, we could say in the 11th and 12th centuries, was still relatively strong rulers. But in the course of the 12th century, for reasons that I'm not going to go into now, the power of the emperors collapsed, temporarily collapsed. They never fully recovered. And the result was there continued to be a Holy Roman Emperor, but the landed aristocracy now thoroughly feudalized Germany in the 12th century. Germany became a fully feudalized country, not in the 11th century as in England, or not in France, where it was going on for centuries. It was only in the 12th century that Germany became fully feudal. But the sad thing is that with a weak central power, Germany remained divided, and feudalism held on in Germany until the French Revolution. It's a terribly weak country by the end of the Middle Ages, whereas France and England were getting stronger. England was getting weaker. Now, the next country I'm going to do two more. We're going to look at Italy, and we're going to look at Spain around about 1100. Well, Italy, we could say, Italy was, I would say, less barbarized, that's the way to put it, than the states that we've been mentioning. Now, I said in the course of earlier lectures that during the Dark Ages, commerce, towns, coinage, all disappeared. The Mediterranean was closed. And so there was an absence of a market economy. And I think that that's generally true. But still in Italy, there was the towns who dated back to Roman times. They still existed, the ruins of these towns. They had regressed. They were not like the towns as they existed in the heyday of the Roman Empire, but there were still towns. There was still a few merchants around. Some vestiges of that sort of life still existed. And most of these towns in Italy, such as they were ruled not by secular officials, but by bishops, by members of the clergy. It even could be the head of a big monastery, or a bishop might be the head of one of these towns. That was the situation, and especially you see this, well, you see it all over Italy, but especially in the northern part of Italy and the north central part of Italy, this was the situation. And we even see, although this area here had been thoroughly, this area, that is, say, Lombardy up here, was taken over by the Lombards, as you remember. Feudalism did impose itself. There was feudal law. Elsewhere in Italy and central Italy and the south, Roman law survived. Barbarian law did not apply. Roman law, towns, little town or townlets, is still carried on. And I would say that the peasantry, although they in the north where the Lombards had been, they had become enserved. In central Italy, right from about here all the way south of Rome, there were small free peasants in central Italy, including even in the lands of the popes. Popes had power here and so on, but the peasants were relatively free. And the last part of Italy, that is to say, the boot, the very southern part, and Sicily was different. The Byzantines still held power in southern Italy until about the 11th century. And here there were large nobles ran big estates, and actually slavery survived. Slavery, which had gone by the boards with the fall of the Roman Empire, we can say, it persisted on these large estates run by nobles who basically were loyal to Constantinople. So in the north, there's a kind of feudalism based on the Lombards. In the center, the peasants are free, and in the south, you have slaves and a nobility that is loyal to the East Roman Empire. The last area I want to consider is Spain or Iberia. Now here, the thing is that the Arabs took over Spain in 711, you should say. It was an Arab kingdom. But in the 9th century, at the beginning of the 9th century, Charlemagne, we can say he invaded the northern part of Spain, known as Catalonia. And this area, already by the 9th century, was um, basically taken away from the Arabs. It became Christian, if you like. And here feudalism was installed. It resembled in many ways the condition of France. I would say this area of Spain. But for the rest, this was Arab territory. And there was a continuous war, really from the time of Charlemagne onwards, between these Christians with their base in Catalonia, and they got a lot of reinforcements from Spain. Feudal knights would come down from France and even as far away as Germany to fight the Arabs in Spain. And these were known as the Wars of Reconquest, crusades against the Arabs. Jihad. Jihad, of course, is an Arab term, but the Christian word, and it means the same thing, crusade. So the Christians were crusading against the Arabs. And as soon as they liberated territory, and they began to liberate more and more territory, I don't want to use the term liberate because it's pejorative. Why is Christianity liberating? It's against Islam. It's absurd. In any case, the territories that were liberated during the 12th and 13th century and forward, they gradually became feudal as well. So I would say that feudalism, by the time you get to the 12th, 13th century, is pretty well established all over Western Europe, except in Italy. And why is that? It's because by this time, the Mediterranean, which had been closed during the Dark Ages, has been reopened. Commerce between Western Europe, based on Italy, has been reopened with the Middle East. The silks, the porcelains, the glassware, the spices from the Middle East and Asia begin to arrive in Europe from the 11th century onwards. And Italy, in the course of the 11th century, these little towns now begin to blossom with new commercial and market life. And so Italy is highly exceptional in this regard. You have a revival of commerce, manufacturing, money, first of all, in Italy, from an early date, from the 11th century. And you see this reflected in the fact that in many of these towns, the newly rich middle-class people are seizing political power from the bishops. Which brings me to the turning point, because what we see is that around the year 1000, we can say, the barbarian invasions that we've been talking about for a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks, these come to an end. A basic stability becomes possible, and gradually there's a certain the kings, or in some cases princes, they begin to get a little bit more authority. There are more peaceful years. There's less violence. I don't want to say that the violence disappears. No, it does. Violence is a fundamental condition of life during the Middle Ages. But nevertheless, some sort of ordered life is possible after 1000. So we enter a new period. Up on that, we have been for several weeks, considering the Dark Ages from 500, the fall of the Roman Empire, from 500 to 1000 AD. After 1000, we're in a new period of the Middle Ages, which historians call not the Dark Ages, but the High Middle Ages, from 1000 to 1300 AD, a new period of peace and economic progress. And indeed, not merely economic progress, but political and social and cultural progress as well. This is the peak of let's just say, the High Middle Ages. They're called high because the Christian culture of the Middle Ages reaches its peak between 1000 and 1300 AD. And this is what we're now beginning to look at. And of course, as I explained, this is essentially a feudal Europe. Feudalism is the dominant system, although, again, I would reiterate, Italy is different. The towns are the predominant feature in Italy as against the rest of Europe. Now, on this basis, then, of relative peace and so on, you have the possibility of a growth of population. And the population now begins to grow rapidly from 1000 AD. There is a remarkable increase in population growth that covers the whole period from 1000 to 1300. And on this basis, you have the remarkable increase in agricultural output. More and more peasants who are producing food is a fundamental condition of this period. Now, I would say that the peasants, of course, in most of these areas were serfs. It's true. They were dependents of direct personal dependence of their overlords. And it was an onerous situation. But at the same time, I would say that because they were the ones who farmed the land, the lords demanded rent. Of course, you had to pay rent, but the lords didn't interfere with the productive activities of the peasants. And furthermore, since labor was essentially scarce initially, say up until around 1200, between 1000 and 1200, therefore the overlords didn't demand too much of the peasants in the form of rent or other exactions. So the condition of the peasants, of course, it was dependent and so on, but was relatively good, especially under conditions of peace. And consequently, they produced large surpluses of food. And some of this food was marketed by the landlords and the rent that they took, the grain, or even some of the peasants could bring food to the market and they could make some money. So there were agricultural surpluses. And these surpluses were made the greater because the peasants, seizing the opportunity under these circumstances, began to make or introduce new inventions. The peasants invented new ways of farming during this period. There are breakthroughs, something we don't see in the ancient world. For example, the iron plow, the iron-tipped plow, becomes general amongst the peasantry of Western Europe during this period. Now, the iron-tipped plow can dig deeply into the heavy, wet soil. And turning this soil deeply, you can produce very good crops in the well-watered soils, particularly of Northern Europe. And they began to improve the For example, they invented horseshoes so the horses could pull the plows more easily through the fields. They produced new collars which secured the plow to the livestock, to the horses or to the oxen. These were important inventions, and the result is that we see the productivity of the soil, which was rich to begin with, greatly improves during this period. There are large food surpluses. And for that matter, even the landlords who want to make as much money as they can from the peasants, in order to process the grain, to mill the grain, the landlords on their own initiative set up thousands, hundreds of thousands of water mills and windmills all over Western Europe, a new source of energy, either water power or wind power, something that was scarcely existed in Roman or Greek times, comes into being during this period. So I would say that maybe antiquity from a cultural point of view was superior, but when you look at it from an economic point of view, you can already see that by the 12th or 13th century, the productive potential of Western Europe is greater than ancient Greece and Rome. This is really dramatic. And the thing is that such improvement in the output of grain means that more and more people can live and not have to engage directly in agriculture. So there's an enormous outburst of the establishment of towns all over Western Europe. Now, of course, there were towns in ancient Greece and Rome, but I'm talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of towns that are come into being from the 11th century until the end of the 13th century, all over in all these countries. Thousands of essentially market towns where there are markets which are basically in which the grain, the food is being sold, but also they can support all kinds of craftsmen and merchants who are producing manufactured goods. There's a great outburst of manufacturing, especially textiles, wool above all, but also linen, all over Europe in these towns. This is all a product of this high Middle Ages. And so we have a great revival of town life, a great spread of the money economy, of trade. And I remind you that the Mediterranean is now open, and there's a huge influx now of imported silk, luxury goods, spices, fine glass from the Middle East and even from China and India during this whole period. So the High Middle Ages, it's a remarkable transformation that has occurred here in the period from 1000 to 1300. And as a result of all of this, of course, the possibility of high culture becomes possible. And as we'll see, the culture is above all, certainly the peasants have their culture. It's an amazing culture of dances, folk dances, of their own particular dresses, and so on. There's a great deal of very interesting craftsmanship. The nobles produce their culture, which is a culture based on the idea of courage. They're warriors, loyalty to their chiefs. Loyalty and courage are what the feudal class believes in, but they also believe in love. They're the ones, the nobles, who invent what we call romantic love during this period. Chivalry comes into being during this period. But above all, yes, there's a peasant culture, there's a feudal culture, but the great culture is the culture of the church, the cathedrals, the great universities that come into being, as we'll see, are produced during this high Middle Ages, as we'll see next week. I bid you a good weekend.